Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. I am with you in your hymnals on page 714, 715 and following. We now turn to Poetry Collection 5 and 6. We're going to begin with an Emily Dickinson offering, The Wind Tapped Like a Tired Man. Before we get there though, I want to start on page 715 at 2b. This is now our focus, figurative language. And of course, we're building in our sophomore year on work that we did in our freshman year. Let's first of all, make sure we get some information in our notes at 2b. Figurative language, I'm just reading with you on 715, is language that is not meant to be taken literally. That is to say, it's to be understood as figurative, right? Poets often use the following figures of speech. Make sure you get these terms in your notes at 2b. Or specific types of figurative language to convey their ideas in fresh and innovative ways. Each of these figures of speech is a comparison, write that down, a comparison of two things that are alike in certain respects but not in others. We'll have three that we concentrate on. Of course, all three of these you've heard of before. The simile is the comparison of unlike things using the word like or as. For example, he runs like a cheetah. The metaphor is one thing is spoken about as if it were something else. For example, during the holidays, the stores are zoos. And personification, an object, animal, idea is spoken of as if it were human. The trees danced in the wind. By making unexpected and surprising comparisons, figurative language helps the reader to think about familiar ideas in new ways. Because figurative language often expresses meaning in concrete pictures, it is an important source of, another word for us in our notes, imagery or word pictures in poetry. That's that concept of show, don't tell, right? And of course, under the reading skill paraphrase, part of paraphrasing is to picture the imagery. Now, I'm going to say this in our study of Poetry Collections 5, 6. And it's so hypercritical. You have it in your notes. We're going to come back to it over and over again. In some ways, this is an extension on what we studied in our freshman year, so make sure it's in your notes. We always have two questions when we hit figurative language. What is it, and how does it work? I would write that down. We're going to come back to it. What is it, and how does it work? It isn't enough for us to be able to point out an example of simile, or metaphor, or personification in the poems that we'll be working with. That's not enough. Oh, there's an example of a use of like or as in comparison, i.e. a simile. We're far more interested in asking the second question, how does it work? How does the simile, how does the metaphor, how does the use of personification work within the poem? How does it, for example, address issues of message, theme? How does it convey the powerful imagery? That will be our question. In other words, we'll be asking to respect, to appreciate the use of the figurative language in some creative way. It seems in the history of poetics that no one does this game better than Emily Dickinson. We, of course, met Emily Dickinson in our freshman year. We'll come back to her now in our sophomore year. We're going to study her in depth in our junior year. Without question, one of the most important poets, especially of the American tradition, no doubt about it. Let's read a little bit about her. As we said in our freshman study of Emily Dickinson, she is so remarkable for so many reasons, not least of which she was agoraphobic and never left her home as an adult hardly at all. She lived in the confines of her house, her father's large house, and the garden that he appropriated for her, where she scribbled lines down that she rarely showed to anyone. And upon her death, it was discovered there were thousands and thousands of lines of this little scribbled stuff on pieces of paper and the like. And in fact, there were a number of people who didn't know what they were looking at was what would be considered some of the greatest poetry of all time. Let's read a little about her. I'm on page 717. Notice her dates, 1830 to 1886. Now regarded as one of America's greatest poets, Dickinson was scarcely known during her own time. She never married, spent almost her entire life in the home of her family. As she grew older, she rarely left her house, the agoraphobic I was speaking of. Although she wrote 1,775 poems, only 7 were published during her life, and those were published anonymously. So let's say really quickly, just to remind, 3 things about how we study Emily Dickinson. So this is huge. 1, because Dickinson didn't leave behind any kind of record about what it was she was saying in her poetry, the way poets will do today in interviews and in essays or whatever, we are pretty much left on our own often to appreciate the work of Emily Dickinson and what's happening. We will see in our sophomore year actually 2 Emily Dickinson offerings, this one and Tell the Truth But Tell the Slant. We'll take a look at that one as well. About both of these, let's say number 2. Dickinson's poetry is always incredibly simple, unbelievably complex. It is not for readers of Emily Dickinson's poetry that the language is often difficult or whatever. It's rather the constructions and tactically of the poems that she's created that sometimes make this poetry complex, and yet wonderfully complex. I mean, when we finish, we kind of go, wow, this is interesting. Number 3, Dickinson, and this is huge, so write it down. Dickinson was very experimental. Very experimental. So we've got a poet, notice, who, for example, is going to, well, just look on page 718. What's the one kind of punctuation that you see more of on 718 than any other piece of punctuation? And you'll immediately jot down in 2B her use of the dash. She loves the dash. She loves to interrupt the rhythm of her line with a pause that will make us reflective. Now again, our job here is to appreciate the personification, write this down at level 1, the personification of the wind as an old man with a cane that comes tapping and entering into her room. Okay? The question won't be, is there personification? The question will be, how does it work? What is the imagery that she is able to create? Let's go ahead now, just read the poem, and then we'll come back to study the genius of Emily Dickinson.
The Wind Tapped Like a Tired Man by Emily Dickinson. The wind tapped like a tired man, and like a host, "Come in," I boldly answered, entered then my residence within. A rapid footless guest, to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand a sofa to the air. No bone had he to bind him, his speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. His countenance a billow, his fingers as he passed let go a music as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. He visited, still flitting, then like a timid man, again he tapped, 'twas flurriedly, and I became alone.
Okay, so let's just pause now. Again, we've got evidences of all 3 of the things we're focusing on for figurative language. Let's just play this game really quickly in 2B. Find a simile in this poem and write it down really quickly. That is to say, a comparison using like or as. Find an example of metaphor in this poem and write it down. That is to say, a comparison, but no like or as is used. And most obviously, personification, giving to the wind this feeling like somehow it's an old tired man that comes tapping with a cane into her room. Let's go ahead now and work through the poem. Notice it's divided up into these 5 stanzas. Notice the use of the dash again. Notice the repetition of certain sounds. The I-N sound, right? The N sound over and over again. The wind, dash, tapped like a tired man, dash. Notice the similes. And like a host. Come in, I boldly answered. Now we're going to play the game. Write it down in 3A. We're going to play the game of what we called, you'll remember, Xenia. X-I-N-I-A. Xenia, that notion of hospitality in our study of the Odyssey. Remember, in the ancient Greek tradition, if somebody shows up, you're supposed to play the host. You're supposed to invite them in. You're supposed to give them a place to sit. You're supposed to give them something to drink, something to eat. And then and only then, after you've played the game of Xenia for a while, then and only then are you allowed within Greek ancient classic culture to ask, who are you and what do you want? Okay? Which is, you'll remember why Odysseus is so aghast at Polyphemus, the Cyclops, the one-eyed monster, who just picks up a couple of Odysseus' men and eats them. It isn't so much that he's a man-eater and eats his men, it's that he's violated the rule of Xenia. Notice here she says, I wanted to be a host, and so she says, I boldly answered to the wind, to the old man, come in, come in. Entered then my residence within a rapid, footless guest. to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand a sofa to the air. In other words, I wanted to give him a place to sit, but there was no it for it to sit, as the old man came in. No bone had he to bind him. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. Notice this simile of the sound of the wind, like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. The challenge of classic poetic simile is not just to make a comparison, but to make a comparison that you can relate to in some way. Hey, watch this. Remember that our learning theory is the ability to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways? That's exactly what great poets and writers do. That is to say, they find comparisons that at first glance you go, oh, everybody's heard a hummingbird in Emily Dickinson's audience. They all know what that means. But what if you put a whole bunch of hummingbirds together? You rarely see a whole bunch of hummingbirds together. Normally you only witness one. Imagine if you put a whole bunch of them together, they would sound somewhat like this wind as it came in. His countenance, that is to say his face, a billow, in other words, frowning. His fingers as he passed let go a music as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. Again, the use of the word as tells us this is a simile. By the way, notice his countenance, a billow, is a metaphor. Notice she doesn't say his countenance was like a billow. His countenance, a billow, makes it a metaphor. He visited, still flitting, then like a timid man. Notice now it's not a tired man. Did you see this? So she changes the adjective from tired to timid. Again, in other words, he's not sure he wants to be there. In other words, it's time for him to leave. He tapped, 'twas flurriedly, and I became alone. In other words, he left. Now, let's ask very quickly, we obviously know what the similes are, what the metaphors are, and of course personification. Let's ask, how does it work? All right, how does it work? At 3a, we can of course just write down a simple message here that weather is sometimes unpredictable. It shows up, it sticks around for a little bit, and then it leaves. Simple, right? There's nothing complicated in that regard. At 2b, though, let's ask the question. We know what the similes are. Pick out your favorite one. Pick out your favorite comparison of a simile, a metaphor, or a personification. What is your favorite one? The wind is like a tired, tapping old man. A timid old man that comes kind of tapping into the room with his cane, stays for a little bit and is gone. Notice two things. One, there's the wind as an old man, which is kind of an interesting way to picture the weather. Not as something frightening, but as something to be welcomed to. Notice Emily Dickinson wants to be nice. Show xenia to the wind, and yet in the end the wind will decide to leave when it wants to leave. You can't control the weather, in other words. Of course, at 3a, we immediately go back to the Twain passage about New England weather, don't we? And any number of other texts that we've studied. Jot down for you, what's your favorite text about weather and nasty weather, or, the wind? Many years ago, there was a famous film called Twister that played this same game, and it was about tornadoes, and it freaked lots of students out. That type of thing. 3a. What is for you a moment when you had to negotiate with the weather? You had to figure out or live alongside the weather. We obviously live with all kinds of different wind. Yes. By the way, jump up to 3a again. When you're a senior, we're going to do a famous poem called Ode to the West Wind by a poet named Shelley. And we'll talk a lot about the effect of wind. What is for you the hardest kind of weather to endure? Is it wind? Is it cold rain? Snow? And when was a time that you thought about the weather almost like a person? And if you could name the different kinds of people, so for example, some people say the spring is like a child, the summer is like a high schooler, and the fall is like a growing older person, and then winter is like a really old person aging. You can get that sense of the seasons, right? Well, Emily Dickinson giving us something to at least consider the next time the wind blows, yes? I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe hunt down more poems of hers. Thank you.